Let's talk about binding. Straight binding is the easiest to cut. It uses the straight of the grain instead of the biased of the grain. Biased binding is really the way to go when you have scalloped edges or curved edges. It is cut on the 45-degree angle so the bias runs through your binding. This binding stretches more and allows you to go around curves very easily. Piping binding stretches the amount of fabric you use because it uses two different fabrics. This binding is also machine sewn, so it shortens your work time. Facing. If you're looking for clean edges to your quilt and you want to put the binding in the background, you need to face your quilt. This method puts the binding on the back only. It's great for wall hangings and picture quilts, so the picture is the main focus of your quilt. How to calculate your binding to make sure you have enough fabric. The simple formula for finding about how many inches of binding you will need is twice the length plus twice the width plus 10 inches for good measurements. This should give you the number of inches you need. How many strips do you need? This is the number of inches needed divided by the width of usable fabric. I use 40. This should give you the number of strips you need. How much fabric you need is calculated by the number of strips you need times the width of the binding you chose. That should equal the number of inches of fabric you need. Binding width. 2¼ inch binding is usable for both hand sewing and machine sewing. 2½ inch binding is what I recommend for machine sewing. When using either of these, you should use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance if you are sewing your binding directly to the edge of your quilt. Using these measurements will help you fill your binding. Should you sew your binding together with straight lines or 45-degree angles? If you are low on fabric, using a straight sewn binding can extend your fabric. When you are mixing up fabrics, straight sewn binding usually blends in with the body of your quilt. When you use a 45-degree sewn binding, it spreads out the seam and makes the results of your binding flatter. Will you fold and iron your binding ahead of time or not? Before you decide whether you will iron over your fabric, you will iron all of your seams open for both straight stitched binding and 45-degree binding. This also makes your seams less bulky. I found an award-winning quilter who has a video on YouTube with a number of recommendations that made sense to me. She suggests when you're ironing over your binding, use spray starch. This will keep the two sides matte and your binding will be more stable when sewing it on. This information will be included in our reference material out on our website, along with other references in this video. I used to iron over my binding ahead of time, and then I found that sometimes I didn't get my crease in the middle, and sometimes I mismatched my edges. In one of the groups I was in, a person mentioned that they don't iron over their binding ahead of time. I decided to try it. Now I finger press and then sew. Because this slows me down as I'm sewing, I find that it's more accurate. I also prefer not to be in front of my ironing board as long as it takes me to iron my binding over. We have all the pieces now for putting our binding on our quilt. Let's watch Sally.
So the first thing for getting a good binding is to have a nice square quilt top and to give it to your quilter, and then have a quilter who's going to give you back a nice square quilt, which I have good luck with the quilters that I use, that I get that back. So I'm going to just assure you that this is nice and square. This is actually not one I made. This is one of the hospice quilts. And so the first step in putting on the binding is, of course, trimming your quilt. I always start with my 15-inch square, and then I line up and get a good corner on here. So I'm lining up a 1/4 inch past the edge of the quilt top. And as you can see, I've got it lined up with the edge of the quilt top at a 1/4 inch. And then this is pretty straight. The block here is pretty straight, especially down here. It's a little bit off, about less than 1/8 of an inch, really. And I can fix that a little bit by moving it down and, you know, and then that still is pretty straight here. And it's a little bit off that way. So we just make it so that it's going to be pretty straight, like straight enough. I'm going to reach over here for my rotary cutter and cut that and cut this. And so now I have a corner.
And you've cut an 1/4 inch
1/4
away
inch
from the
edge
corner.
of the quilt. And the reason for that is because I'm going to use that extra to fill my binding at the end, to have a nice full binding. And I know that that's what they want you to do for a show of any kind, but this is the way I was taught to do it. So I come over here with the square, and this time it matches up. It's really nice and square over here. So everything is very nice that way. And I always go off the edge and make it nice and square. Now, I knew that this was a square quilt when I started out, and it's not very big, so I don't really even need this 24-inch ruler. But I will then do the 1/4 inch here and do it in between. And as you can see, there's a little bit more batting here than there is here, but that's just because that's sort of the pull on the quilt when it was quilted. And then I come and do a square over here. Now, this is the long side of the quilt. So sometimes, especially if I'm doing a really big quilt, I will take and take my long ruler, and I will measure the 1/4 inch here. And you've got to be sure, sometimes you have to have a chair or something holding the quilt, that the quilt's not pulling down. But I will take a pencil and draw on the batting where that 1/4 inch is going to be. And then pull it over this way and be sure that you don't cut your extra fabric underneath, and draw. And sometimes you can go all the way to the corner, and that's just going to help you as a guide to be sure you're getting it straight. So even if you're not going to add this 1/4 inch on like I do, that pencil line is going to help you so that when you come over on this side, you're going to be able to square it up nice. Now, you also might want to draw down the other way too and be sure that it's straight. I was only showing you what I do on a really large quilt. This one is not necessary because this is definitely a square quilt top. Pencil line is really sort of light, but and I would never use it as the line that I'm going to cut on, but it helps keep you going a little bit straight. If you notice, I keep pulling it up because it's pulling down a little bit, the weight of the quilt. We have two sides done. And all that extra fabric to do more quilting with. Ta-da! All trimmed. So these are 2.5-inch strips. I'm a firm believer in 2.5-inch strips. I don't think that we need to try and save that much fabric. And if you're short on fabric, maybe a 2.25 inch, but I just don't think a 2-inch will ever work and make a nice binding for you. Okay, so I've got this sewn together like this, or laid together like this, not sewn. And I fold it so that it's at the 45-degree angle. And I will finger press it, or I will press it on my handy dandy iron that's right next to my sewing machine. And then I've got a nice line to sew on. And I've got nice pink thread in this so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just sewing down the line. And then I make sure that I get to the end of that piece. And I just chain piece these. I don't like starting and stopping on my machine, so I just chain piece. Put those together, fold it down, give it a quick swipe with the iron. Chain piece one more. And I figured out how many strips I needed by the measurements that were there. And for some reason, this has got way too much binding. I guess it's because they're really long pieces. Seams. You just cut them apart and trim them off, and you're all set. I usually iron them ahead of time. I don't know if everyone does that, but the key thing for ironing them in half ahead of time is being sure, especially if it's a plain color, solid color like this, being sure that you have the right sides out and you don't end up coming along for a seam and suddenly you've got a seam on the outside. I just do this.
But you iron open the seams first, right?
I iron them open when I come to them.
Okay.
Okay. So lay the quilt out on the nice big surface here. I love this sewing table. I love it. And I will put the binding that I just dropped on the floor back behind. So I find it easier to pull it that way. And I've still got my pink thread, so hopefully that'll help you see where I'm sewing. And I just put a big amount off to the side, and then I'm sewing a 1/4 inch in, so I know that this is a 1/4 inch. Because I cut it a 1/4 inch. And some of the places where it's a little bit smaller, I will check as I go and be sure that I'm sewing a 1/4 inch in. Because sometimes the fabric is, you know,
Sometimes the quilting takes the fabric in more than what it
Yes.
should.
yeah. I will line up and I can see right here that there's a line where that goes. And so I'm going to run my foot along the edge of the binding and just be sure as I go along that I've got the 1/4 inch hanging off. So and a lot of times I will come down here and put a pencil mark where the 1/4 inch is, but it's actually going to be a 1/4 inch from the edge here. So it's a 1/2 inch from the edge there. Does that make sense, Lynn?
Yes, you're marking where you're going to sew to.
Yes, that's where I'm going to stop sewing.
And since you're 1/4 inch off the batting
Yes,
and you're 1/4 inch sewing, you want a 1/2 inch mark.
to where I'm going to stop. And a lot of times I don't use the pencil mark. I just lay my ruler there and stop. But
I have a place on my machine that I know where is a 1/2 inch. Like
yes,
you stopped right where your clear thing is, so that's
Yeah.
your 1/2 inch.
yeah,
I know where my 1/4 inch and where my 3/8 inch is.
yes. You're supposed to sew over in this direction or sew down to the corner. And I don't do that because I've got all this extra here. And I need to be able to make my corner go and be nice and mitered.
So tell me how you folded that.
I folded it back
45
for
degree.
45 degrees. And then
What are you matching up to on this side?
on this side here,
Your next fold.
your next fold, I'm matching up with the edge of the binding on the previous side.
Oh, the binding and not the
Yes,
the fabric that you're actually sewing on.
yes.
Okay.
The edge of the binding right there. So that's going to make a nice mitered corner there. And if Lynn were standing right there with my iron, I might put a little press there. But that's okay. I can come back and then I can feel under there where the 2 layers of fabric are. And I just start.
You don't backstitch?
Yes.
Okay.
I normally do backstitch.
It's a little different with somebody watching over your
Yes.
shoulder.
And I want to come back. I'm going to stop here and come back and show how that corner then. And a lot of times you're going to have to trim a little bit of this out of there, especially, but this is how it's going to come together when you're actually doing it. So you've got a nice mitered corner that goes right out. And I always will sew that, hand sew that.
Okay.
Okay. But that's how it looks inside.
All right. So we're going to watch you sew the rest.
Okay. So you're watching 2 places. You're watching the edge of the whole thing, the batting here is going along that line there. And then the foot is going along where you've lined up the binding and the edge of the quilt top. This one has been a really easy quilt to work with because I got a 1/4 inch of batting off the edge. And if you can hear the snoring in the background, that's been the music to my sewing for the last year plus.
Introducing Layla.
She sleeps in that crate in the sun. So a 1/2 inch down here on the edge. And actually, I want to be sure it's a 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric here. So it's a little bit more than a 1/2 an inch, which means I didn't get it trimmed quite. I have a nice 45-degree angle and then 90-degree. And as I said, that corner wasn't trimmed quite right. So it's going over that line just a little bit. A little bit, it's about 3/8 of an inch along here rather than a 1/4 inch. I didn't finish sewing the binding down because I'm going to bring it to the meeting for everybody to see how that's done. But I do want to talk about the hand sewing. And one of the best rules I learned was that you always match your thread to the binding, not the back of the quilt, because you're sewing it sort of under the binding. So I don't have some very good choices, but that looks like it's probably the best choice. Maybe. Yeah, I think that's probably the best choice. And I only use one strand of thread. I get in these times that I start using bigger, double thread. And then I have so much trouble threading the needle that I don't do that anymore. And I take pretty small stitches. If you're going to take big stitches, I would say you want to use a double strand of thread to hold it. But get that on there. And I don't necessarily put a knot in it because I'll show you what I'm going to do here. I'm going to snip off a couple threads. And then I will sometimes go all the way around my quilt with the little clips. And I know how much to fold it over because it's gets folded over to, and you can see the pink thread there where I sewed it. So it gets folded over to just cover that. My mother puts the clips on and she'll put like 4 clips on and she'll sew where those are and then she'll move them along. But I've got enough clips that I can go around an entire quilt. I've got my clips and then I take my thread and sometimes I'll put a knot in it. Sometimes I don't. And I sort of fold this back and I tie the knot underneath the binding. and then pull the thread down and start sewing. And I always take small stitches, and that's just the way I do it. And I've learned a long time ago that you don't take 2 stitches at a time and try and pull them through, because this is always what happens. And here I only took 1 stitch and I got a knot there. But 1 stitch at a time. And then I know that there are people who go the other direction. So they're doing it this way. But I've come to realize it's exactly the same thing. You're still going through under here and coming up in the edge of the binding. And you want to be sure that you have a good, at least 2 threads that you're coming up in the binding so that it's going to hold. And I know people have talked about that machine stitching the binding is sturdier, it lasts longer. My son was just home he retired from the Navy, and he was sleeping while he was visiting me under the quilt that I made him as his high school graduation gift, and he took with him. And he's been using that quilt for 20 years, and the binding is still on. It's very faded, and it's seen a lot of use, but the binding is still on. So we're going to pretend like I've reached the end of my thread, and a lot of times I will like tie the little knot where you just go back through the loop and tie that. But I always go underneath the binding and do several stitches underneath as a form of a knot, because it doesn't show. And then when I start next to it, it will look it won't show as a knot on there. Okay, so we're going to go back and do a corner here with the hand sewing. And that is always where there's extra threads that you have to cut off. And they're even more obvious here because they're pink instead of green. And so I always come up to the corner from this side. So I'm going to put a couple clips in on this side. And then I'll come over here and put a clip in over here. And then I have a nice corner that I can, and see, I've pushed that back there with my thumbnail. And the idea is to match it up right here. And I put a clip there to hold it until I get to that spot. So I'm going to start the stitching here. Normally I would be just sewing along and coming to that. So I'm 1 stitch away from the corner, and I will go to under here and I will grab that piece there. And then do a little stay stitch there. So it keeps my corner nice and matched up. And then I try and make sure that I'm going under and coming up. And I don't know if you noticed, but I did not trim off any of the batting in these corners, because there really wasn't enough. It wasn't thick enough batting that it had to be trimmed. And then I sometimes will go back and stitch if I think it needs some more stitches, or I will just go through on the other side and stitch that down on the other side. And then that keeps the nice mitered corner in place. Does that look nice? And since I've got lots of thread, I can come back through on this side and continue stitching. I always end up putting a lot more stitches in the corners than I do on the rest of the binding, just to be sure that it's holding it in place. Okay, so we're going to do a short demo on a facing. So for a facing, at least in the style that I always do, you need 4 5-inch squares. So I am going to cut 2 5-inch squares because we're just going to do one side of this. And then I'll finish the rest later and bring it to the meeting with me. So, and they don't have to be horribly exact, I suppose, but so there's 1 5-inch square and then the other 5-inch square. And I'm going to set those aside and throw away the scraps. And then you cut 2.5-inch strips, just like you do for a binding. And I'm just going to get this folded and cut the 2.5-inch strips. These are the cutoffs of the backing after it was quilted and trimmed. For this, I've trimmed this quilt the same way I did with the binding one, but I'm not really going to use that extra to put into a facing, because your facing you want to be nice and flat. I pressed this in half, and I really feel like you have to do that with a facing. So I cut the 2.5-inch strips. Feel like you have to fold it in half and press it with a facing, because you've got too many things that you're lining up. And this will be, and I really, you can sew strips together, but this is the cutoff from when the quilt was quilted.
So size-wise, it's going to fit better.
Yes. So you're going to have a strip, one strip for each side, and it's going to fit. And then those 5-inch squares that we cut, we're going to fold them into a triangle and press them. And sometimes if you're doing a wall hanging, you might cut less than 5 inches, but I really like 5 inches. I think it turns out the best. And then this is the easiest thing to sew on. You will not believe it. And I'm going to put the corner there. So it's going to go around to the back to there. This is the part I often do wrong. I have this urge to put it like this because I'm going to want the raw edge under that. But if you think about it, you're going to put it like this because when you turn it, it'll be under when you turn it.
So you're going to
So
put it
you
on top of the
overlap.
corner, overlap, and then you're going to sew the whole side to the other side and set up the other corner.
Yes.
And the reason you're sewing it on top is so it will be under.
Yes, when you turn it around to the
Right.
back, it'll be under. And we've got it set at a 1/4 inch. And you're going to come all the way out here to the corner, not start at the edge of the binding.
You are sewing 1/4 inch away.
Yes, 1/4 inch away. And I'm lining it up with my nice squared off quilt. And Pam was the one who quilted this for me. And as you can see, we both did a good job keeping it nice and square, except where I pieced it a little bit off there. So we get close and we're going to put the corner piece down here and sew right off the edge. And then you take it to the ironing board, which
Which
I
we're
would
going
not,
to take and say we did.
yes. And you press it nice and flat there. But this is batik fabric, so I'm not sure I even need to do that. And you're going to do another line of stitching.
Just on the 2.5 inch.
Yeah, that's all you really need.
Okay.
Because this is, and actually you could even go down here past this so that this will, fold over nice for you.
Okay. On the same stitch line?
No, you sew like 1/8 of an inch just inside the same stitch, which you can't see very well, but
So this is to make it so that it'll stay over?
yes, so it will come back over. So can you see? It's sewn right along here. There's 2 lines of stitching.
Yes.
And then,
And so, hang on, that's to make it so that this stays flat.
yes.
So when you do your next fold, it comes over with you.
Yes. And you want to be able to see the front of the quilt when you're actually sewing it down. So, and again, I hand sew because I don't like that extra line of stitching
Okay.
that you would end up with.
So put a couple of clips in it and we can see kind of what it's going to look like.
And I will finish this up and bring the finished quilt with its facing in. So this is what it looks like on the outside. And that's,
On the back side.
yeah, backside.
And when you do these corners, they'll be sewn all the way across and you
Yes.
have to poke them out so that
Yes. And they poke out to be really nice corners.
Okay, so that's facing. Thank you.
Before you actually sew your binding on, you should check to make sure that each of your corners does not have a seam in it. I lay mine out ahead of time so that I can make sure that the seams are elsewhere. And I put a pin in mine down here where I'm going to be starting because I leave a little hangover. You should also check to make sure that there aren't any seams near where you're going to be joining. Otherwise, you're going to have 2 seams together. I had enough fabric that I could take and get rid of the seam that was right next to mine. So I cut this off. I bet you're wondering why I have the back up and not the front up. This binding is piping binding. Piping binding is made by taking 2 strips of fabric that you cut into different sizes. I have made piping binding that is 2.5 inches wide. I used 1 5/8 of the fabric to be the flange, and 1 3/8 of fabric that's supposed to be your binding fabric. I sew the individual colors together first. Then I sew the two colors side by side. When you iron them over, it creates this little bit of flange. When you sew it on, you sew it with the flange color up on the back. Then when you wrap it around, you get a flange on the front. This is one of the easiest bindings to put on because then on the front you can just sew with a like color in this little flange groove. Here we come to the point where we have to join the ends of our binding. I leave about 10 inches from at the beginning when I'm start sewing. So I will put this out and then I know exactly where I want to kind of stop with the other end of my sewing. I've sewn down to the point where we've got 10 inches between the front and end. I wouldn't go any bigger than that. This gives you plenty of room. You can go a little smaller. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is we need to find the center point in here. Well, since this is 10 inches, all we have to do is bring this to this other point, fold it in half, and now we have the center point here. This is a 2.5 inch binding, so I have a 2.5 inch ruler. I'm going to match up the center points of the ruler, and then I'm going to open it up. Now I know where I'm going to cut this side to. You can also use a scrap of binding because this is probably the most accurate. And if your binding is an odd size, then you can just use it for your measurement. So for me, now that I have the general place where it is, I'm just going to fold it over and I'm going to take and make it so that when I cut it, it's a nice straight edge. Now I've got this side cut and ready to work on. First thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to overstretch it. I'm not going to let it be too loose. I'm going to get it just right so that it lays flat, and I'm going to pin it there. Now I have my reference point for the other side of where my overhang is. I bring my right side binding over here, and I'm going to mark right where that edge is. I tend to go a little skimpier than what I need because I feel like fabric stretches better. For me, I take and make a crease with that being there and then I clip it. Or if you're new to the game, the first few times you do this, I would suggest you make a line instead of cutting it. Then when you get more comfortable with it, you'll be cutting the end so that you don't have to worry about drawing the line and matching a line up. For me, I'm just going to go ahead and cut right off the bat. I know that my measurement is correct, and if I take and do it where this point is like this, I can line it up like this and just cut my binding. We're going to have to take and manipulate these out to give yourself more room. The nice thing to do is to take the quilt and fold it on itself so that you get your two sew lines closer to each other. That gives you plenty of room to have your ends loose. We're going to open them up first. Then, to help you know what to do, we're going to put our palms on them. Right palm, left palm. My right palm, basically just like it is, pulls itself out. My left palm goes under and over, and that's how you get your two ends so that they're matched, like when you're sewing your binding ahead of time with their 45 degree. First thing I do is match the corners and pin them. Then I match the edge and I pin it. Then I match the other edge and pin this other corner. Now you're ready to sew from corner to corner to get your last seam in your binding.
Then I take it to my sewing machine and sew it from corner to corner. In this picture, you'll notice that I have cluck tape on my machine. When you're doing binding, cluck tape does just as well as drawing a line. You just need to keep your two corners lined up with the red line in the center.
Now that you have your binding sewn corner to corner, test it. Open it up before you cut your seam. Make sure that the binding lies flat. It doesn't have too much stretch in it, and it doesn't have any billows or puffiness in it. It should be flat enough for you to sew comfortably. If it checks out, then come back and trim your seam. Open up your seam with an iron or a finger press, and then recrease your binding in half. Now take it to your sewing machine and sew the last of the binding to the quilt. And it should lay down nice and flat without stretching or ripples. When I'm glue basting a quilt, I first come in and blind baste the corners so that they stay put while I'm sewing in my last step. I put Elmer's glue in one of my old Roxanne bottles. These tips, if you pay for them, you're going to spend about $10 plus shipping to get 2 of them. You're going to spend $10 to get 1 bottle of Roxanne. So the quickest and easiest way to see if you like Roxanne glue is use it. And then when you're done with the bottle, use the Elmer's glue because it's less expensive. Let me tell you why I got to where I glue baste. When I first was trying this, I would pin baste it. You pin it on the front and you make sure that your pins are in the right position in the back so that when you sew, you're sewing just that little amount over. Then I tried clipping, and clips move too much. So I wasn't getting the best results from what I was doing. And since I sew for the public, and I have folks who ask me to do their binding for them, I took and started glue basting. Why do I use Roxanne, or why did I use Roxanne? And I will probably still continue to use it because it's easy to sit in your chair. You sit down and you put a little bit of glue in the area that you're wanting to glue your binding to. You flip it over, you hold it in place for a few minutes, and it sticks, unlike Elmer's glue. But I saw a video, and she used Elmer's glue for a lot of things. But what she did was she would put it on, fold it over, and hit it with an iron. And then that puts it in place, and then you move on to the next. This makes it easier for me once I get it all done like that to be able to come back here and just stitch in the ditch right here, and I get a nice professional stitch on the back. It does miss on occasion, but when I'm done, after I sew the whole thing, I go back and look for those misses if there is any, and I repair them on the spot. Here's a little trick. If you have a quilter friend who has some empty spools from their cone spools, if you store your glue upside down like this, it prevents the tip from getting crusted over. What have I learned in this journey that I've taken watching Sally and doing some research? I learned that my binding was okay. It wasn't really packed. So I need to add a little bit of batting to my binding. The way I'm doing this is I'm leaving a 1/16 of an inch of batting showing and moving my binding over that far. This way I also don't wander over on this side if I'm trying to match my binding to the side of my quilt. You can see by the needle that I'm sewing a scant 3/8 of an inch from the edge of my ruler. That's where my foot sews. If you take the scant
3/8 and you add the 1/16, I'm actually sewing 3/8 of an inch full. Then what happens with the math is you have 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance. You have a fold over that's 3/8 of an inch. Then you fold it over another 3/8 of an inch and you reach the seam. And if it's just past the seam a little bit, which is what you want when you're machine sewing, you can stitch in the ditch and only have a small hangover of about 1/8 of an inch, which is what I'm looking for. And since you're having to pull it a little bit, the batting is getting a little fuller in your binding fold.